She's not in pain, she's changing. And if he touches the wrong placine, either of them will survive. She fell from the sky, wrapped in living armor that refused to let her go. Her skin burned like starlight, her breath shallow, ragged, and every second, the suit tightened further. He was just a man in the woods, ex-military, worn down, tired of the galaxy's noise. Until the moment she crashed into his world violet, skinned, trembling, and begging for help. What began as survival became something else. Because beneath that armor wasn't just an alien soldier. She was a weapon who no longer wanted to be used. And he was the only one who could save her. The cabin was dim, lit only by the orange flicker of firelight curling from the iron stove in the corner. Wind creaked through the rafters, and somewhere deep in the woods, something howled once and then went still. Frank crouched low beside the woman, now slumped in his chair, her violet skin slick with sweat, her breath shallow and rapid. She didn't look human, at least not entirely, and the thing wrapped around her body didn't look like any armor he'd ever seen. It pulsed, organic, intelligent, dangerous. Black plating curved over her shoulders and ribs, glowing with faint pulses of electric blue. It moved on its own, tightening inch by inch like it had a mind and purpose. "It's adapting," she whispered through clenched teeth, "constricting. If it locks me lungs." Frank didn't flinch. He slipped on a pair of battered mechanic gloves, the kind stained from a dozen years of engine grease and bad decisions. The flashlight between his teeth cast long shadows across the cabin walls as he studied her body. "You need a hospital," he muttered, already knowing what she'd say. Her eyes sharp, Farrell flashed toward him. "Number knife, steady hand, not human tech, just you." Her fingers clamped around his wrist. He almost pulled away, but stopped. Her skin was burning, not fever warm, furnace hot. She wasn't bluffing. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just armor, it was a parasite, a prison, and it was trying to make her body part of itself. The plates over her abdomen twitched. He watched them rise and fall with her breathing, syncing with the rhythm of her lungs like it was learning how to replace them. He'd seen a lot in his time: black market augments, off-world exosuits, rogue AI prosthetics, but this was something else. Something alive. The room had gone quiet, save for the subtle mechanical hiss of her breathing and the low hum rising from her armor. It wasn't just a suit, it was something living, reactive. A second skin with its own will. Frank crouched lower, eyes scanning the black, burnished plating across her midsection. Faint blue veins of energy flickered under the surface like it was dreaming in code. He ran his gloved fingertips along the seam, slow and steady, tracing the line between her ribs and hip, watching for any movement. "Not the left seam," she breathed out, voice tight. "That'll trigger a neurosync loop. Full neural shock." Frank glanced up, arching one brow with a crooked grin. "That sounds made up." She didn't laugh. Her jaw clenched as another pulse rippled beneath the plating. He kept working, blade in hand, no one, meant for precision, not force. This wasn't about prying metal. It was about convincing it to let go. Each plate resisted at first, then gave with a soft click, like a stubborn lock finally releasing under just the right pressure. The first layer slid aside, exposing violet skin beneath, slick with sweat, twitching as cold air kissed the surface. She flinched. Her breath hitched, and her thighs tensed, muscles reacting instinctively to the intrusion, to the sensation. Frank paused. "It's got muscle memory," he murmured. "When you panic, it tightens." "Then don't give me a reason to panic." Her voice was sharp but trembling, the kind of strength that came from discipline and not calm. He didn't respond, just moved on to the next segment. His hands worked with surgical patience, tracing curves, easing another plate loose. The second one peeled away with a quiet snap. Her entire body jerked slightly, and her eyes fluttered closed. "If I start saying things," she whispered, voice ragged, "just ignore them." He nodded once, didn't look at her face. "Just breathe," he said gently. "You're safe." The blade moved again, slower this time, guided by instinct and heat. The armor resisted in some places, quivered in others, almost as if it were testing him too. And still, she sat there barely holding it together, while a stranger peeled her open like a secret. There was no sound but the crackle of the fire and the soft clicks of surrender. And beneath it all, something unspoken, something starting to shift between them. The chest plate gave way with a soft click, releasing a hiss of warm vapor into the cabin's heavy air. Steam coiled upward, catching the firelight as it drifted like breath escaping a body. Frank leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing. "That vent," he muttered, "it's right over your heart." She didn't flinch, just looked at him with a flicker of something unreadable behind those dark, fever-glazed eyes. "Didn't want you to get nervous," she said quietly. There was no smile in her voice, just weariness. And something else, something she hadn't named yet. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed between them, filled with heat, the soft rise and fall of her chest beneath the clinging fabric of her underlayer. It hugged her form like a second skin still holding on even after the armor had let go. A single bead of sweat traced a path down her temple, catching in the hollow of her jaw before disappearing into the curve of her throat. She took a slow breath. "I need you to help stabilize me," she said. Her tone had shifted, no longer strained, but deliberate. Frank tilted his head, wary now. "What kind of help?" Her gaze didn't break from his. Not once. No hesitation, no shame. "My kind doesn't just overheat," she said. "We burn out, fast, unless we're grounded." Grounded how? Thermal, neural, emotional, all of it. Proximity resets the system. She stepped closer. The air around her shimmered with residual heat, like the aftershock of a dying star. Her voice dropped, low and even. "Just touch me, Frank." Another step. The space between them shrank until her breath was mingling with his. "You're the only anchor I have." Her fingers hovered just above his chest, close enough for him to feel the tremble in them, the desperation she wasn't saying out loud. There was no seduction in it, no game, just survival, raw and fragile. And trust, maybe the rarest thing of all. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the floor, flickering like breath. The air in the cabin had thickened dense with heat and tension, and something unspoken, humming just beneath the surface. His arms were around her now, no armor, no barrier, just skin soft, burning, foreign pressed to his. Her pulse thudded against his chest, fast and uneven, like a warning gore, a plea. "It's not supposed to be intimate," she murmured, breath catching at the edge of the words. He didn't pull away. His voice stayed low, steady. "Then why does it feel that way?" She didn't answer. Couldn't. Her body trembled against him, not from fear but from something deeper. A primal unraveling. The last of her resistance melting beneath his touch. The remnants of her armor shuddered once, then peeled away in silent surrender, slipping from her hips, falling like dead petals to the floor. Steam rose where it touched the air. Her legs buckled. He caught her before gravity claimed her, cradling her against him like she was something both fragile and dangerous. She was lighter than she looked, but hot too hot. Not fever, not pain, something else, something alive. He carried her across the cabin in silence and laid her gently on the cot, the old frame creaking beneath her weight. Her eyes stayed closed, but her breathing told him everything. Fast, strained, barely contained. His hand found the base of her spine fingers tracing the ridges of muscle, feeling the tension curled there like a fist. "Where's the worst of it?" he asked, his voice a whisper. She swallowed hard. "My core," she rasped, "upper thighs, it's spreading too fast." He didn't flinch. "Then I've got you." His fingers moved with care, with purpose, pressing into the points where her control faltered, where the heat surged wild and unchecked. She arched slightly beneath his touch, breath hitching, knuckles whitening against the blanket. He didn't speak again. There was no need. His hands did the talking, her body did the answering. And somewhere between the silence and the contact, the storm began to ease. The fire had dimmed to glowing embers, their light flickering across the beams of the old cabin like distant memories refusing to die. The room was quiet, now suspended in that soft, breathless stillness that only comes after everything else has been stripped away. They lay close-eskin to skin beneath a blanket too thin to matter heat, still pulsing between them, alive and restless. Her breath was shallow, her voice low and uneven as it brushed his ear. "It wasn't just overheating," she whispered. "My species, we bond during trauma." He turned his head slightly, just enough to see the edge of her face in the dark. "You mean like mating?" "Not like," she replied. "Biologically. Engineered. Hormonal regulators shift under survival stress. Our bodies don't just heal, They adapt. Fuse. If compatibility is high, it triggers a reproductive cascade. Her hand found his and guided it to the center of her abdomen. Beneath the surface, heat throbbed like a buried star's low, rhythmic, undeniable. "Your body's changing," he said. "Not pregnant," she whispered, "but preparing, as if I were." There was a pause, not from hesitation but gravity, the kind that pulls not just bodies, but choices. "If we link again," she murmured, "it might complete the bond, permanently." The silence between them tightened, dense with meaning. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He just looked at her, really looked like he finally understood the weight of what she was carrying. "Then tell me," he said, "what do you need?" She leaned closer, her forehead resting against his, breath warm against his skin, trembling slightly. "I need you," she said. Not as a request, not as surrender. As something inevitable. The sky hadn't turned yet, but the darkness felt thinner, like it was preparing to lift. Frank stirred before the first light touched the windows, instinct pulling him from whatever restless sleep he'd managed. Across the room, she was already standing, dressed, still barefoot, her back to him, her silhouette framed by the open crack of the cabin door, where cold air leaked in around the edges like a warning. She didn't turn around when she spoke. "Something's coming," she said softly. "I can feel it." He didn't question her. He'd learned by now some things didn't need proof. Outside, the forest was too still. Not a single bird call. No rustling in the underbrush. Just a silence that didn't feel like peace, but preparation. Frank swung his legs over the edge of the cot, muscles aching, heartbeat steady. He moved to the corner of the room and knelt, prying open a hidden floor panel with one hand. A metal hatch creaked free, revealing a stash that didn't belong in a mechanic's cabin. Black polymer crates, gunmetal casings, worn insignias faded by time and secrecy. He pulled out a folded tactical suit and stood. "I wasn't just a mechanic," he said without looking up. She glanced over her shoulder, catching the bundle midair as he tossed it to her. "Didn't think you were," she murmured. She unfolded the suit, eyes scanning every seam like it told her something. Maybe it did. "They'll come for me," she said. "My kind doesn't leave loose ends." Frank zipped up the side of his vest, loading a sidearm into the inner pocket. "Then they'll meet both of us." He wasn't trying to be heroic, just honest. And outside, the wind shifted again just enough to carry the scent of something unfamiliar on the breeze. Something closer than it should be. The trees stood still, their skeletal branches reaching skyward like silent witnesses. Light filtered through the canopy in fractured shafts, gold slicing the mist that clung low to the forest floor. Movement broke the quiet, subtle, deliberate. They came in from the east, their forms shimmering in and out of visibility. 3 of them, cloaked, silent, predators wrapped in advanced tech, confident in their hunt. But Bastina didn't wait for the first move. She moved like lightning, no sound, just speed. One step, and she vanished into a blur of motion. Her knee struck the first figure's ribs before he even registered her presence. The stunned pulse from her gauntlet sending him into the dirt, twitching. The second turned too slow. Frank's rifle snapped upward. One clean shot, no hesitation. The round hit just below the collar-precise final. The soldier dropped like his strings had been cut. The third stepped out of the Hazea walking tank wrapped in an exoframe, cannons mounted to both shoulders, servos hissing with every move. Heavy, unshakable, enraged. But Bastina didn't hesitate. She ran straight at him, low and fast, dodging a burst of plasma that melted bark and shattered stone. She leapt high, twisting midair, and drove a curved plasma dagger deep into the back of his armor, right into the spinal housing. Sparks exploded. The giant stumbled forward with a scream of ruptured metal and flickering energy. He crashed to his knees, silent. Smoke rose around them in curling plumes. The battle had lasted less than a minute. Frank stood, breath steady, rifle cooling in his grip. "Remind me," he said, eyes on her, "never to get you angry." She turned to him slowly, hair falling loose across her brow. Her chest rose and fell with a rhythm not entirely from the fight. "That wasn't anger," she replied softly, voice low and edged with fire. "That was polite." Then she stepped forward, still riding the high of instinct and adrenaline, and kissed him. It wasn't tentative. It was breathless, bold. The kind of kiss that left smoke curling around their skin even as the real flames licked the wreckage behind them. His hand rose, fingers brushing the side of her neck, then settling around it, steady, not claiming, not controlling, just anchoring her in the moment. "This, your idea of a cool down?" he murmured against her lips. Her reply was nothing more than a breath, but it burned hotter than fire. "This is me," she said, choosing to feel. The smoke curled thick around the clearing, rising in slow, lazy spirals that blurred the edges of reality. The scent of scorched metal clung to the air, but beneath it, something else. Something colder. A shimmer in the haze, a shape, stepping through like a ghost that remembered its name. He didn't wear armor. He didn't need to. His presence said enough. Regal, calculated, deadly. Her cousin. Royal blood. Familiar eyes, but devoid of warmth. His smile was soft. Patient like this had all been inevitable. "You were never meant to be free," he said, voice smooth, almost kind. His fingers tapped a device strapped to his wrist. No flourish, no warning. A pulse. Bestina cried out, a sharp, tearing sound that cut through the quiet like a blade. Her body twisted in place, knees buckling as she collapsed to the dirt, trembling, gasping. Frank moved without thinking, catching her before she hit the ground. Her skin was burning 1 second, then freezing the next, her limbs rigid, her breath choked. "Neural, override," she managed, voice thin, shredded. Frank's jaw tightened. His eyes shot up, fury radiating off him like heat. "You bastard." But the cousin was already gone. A flicker of light, then nothing. The clearing fell still again like nothing had ever happened. Frank looked down. Her lips were pale now, her pulse flickering beneath the skin of her throat. He lifted her into his arms, pressing her close, shielding her from the cold that had already started to creep in. "Stay with me," he whispered, the words not a plea but a command forged in desperation. She shivered once, eyes fluttering half open. Her voice was little more than breath, but it carried weight. "It's not over," she said, "they always come back." And somewhere behind them, the wind shifted. Again, the light inside the hideout was dim, flickering faintly from an old generator humming somewhere in the walls. The silence wasn't restful. It was thick close, like the whole room was holding its breath. She lay curled on the cot, her body shaking beneath a thin blanket, jaw clenched to keep from crying out. Her skin had turned pale violet, flushed only at the edges. The fire inside her no longer surging but flickering, wild and unfocused. Frank knelt beside her, sliding the injector into her shoulder with practiced care. The stabilizer hissed as it emptied into her bloodstream. Her fingers found his wrist, gripped tight. "I hate this," she whispered, voice tight with anger and exhaustion. Feeling weak. He didn't answer right away, just held her gaze, steady and grounding. "You're not weak," he said, quiet but firm. "You're human, at least where it counts." She exhaled slowly, eyes closing for a second, just long enough to gather something inside herself. Then she reached up and pulled him closer, not urgently, not out of desperation, but with a quiet certainty that asked for no permission. "Stay," she said, her breath warm against his jaw. "For the heat, for the storm, for me." He leaned in, not because he was needed, but because he chose to be. Their kiss wasn't frantic. It wasn't choreographed by adrenaline or survival. It was raw, unguarded, full of everything they hadn't said and everything they'd risked just to make it here. It didn't matter that the world outside was still chasing them. In this moment, in the stillness between heartbeats, they weren't fugitives or soldiers or experiments. They were simply two people burning slowly into something new. The hum of dormant machinery filled the bunker like a long-forgotten breath drawn once more. Dust shimmered in the glow of flickering screens, their ancient circuitry sputtering back to life under Frank's steady hands. The air smelled of ozone and rust like ghosts waking from sleep. He stood at the center of it all, surrounded by relics of a past he never meant to revisit. Star maps, comms arrays, off-world frequency readers tuned to signals no one else believed were real. One by one, they lit up. Behind him, Bestina moved with silent purpose, already scanning the readouts before he said a word. "I know where he is," she said, her voice low, deliberate. "The signal came from the relay tower, West Ridge, off-grid, high altitude, but it's him." Frank didn't ask how she knew. Some things didn't need explaining. Then we burn it down, he answered, as if it had been the plan all along. There was no ceremony to the way they moved, no dramatic speeches, just the quiet weight of people who had run out of choices and decided not to run anymore. He opened a side panel, laid out weapons with the ease of memory, pulse rifles, breacher charges, one field blade still stained from a war no one admitted had happened. She slid into rebuilt armor piece by piece, the plates locking into place with soft clicks. Not the full set, just what they'd salvaged. Enough to move, enough to fight. The black metal clung to her like resolve. He donned his coat-told, sun-faded, frayed at the cuffs but still heavy with purpose. The weight of who he used to be. They met near the door, the last map spread open on the table. A red mark drawn in silence. Coordinates, not promises. "No more running," she said. "No more hiding," he replied. Then they walked out together side by side. No hesitation, no glancing back. Her armor caught the light like obsidian. His coat lifted in the wind, ragged but defiant. And just before they crossed the threshold, she looked at him one last glance, soft around the edges, sharp at the core. "And if it gets stuck again?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He didn't blink. "Then I'm begging for it." And with that, the door closed behind them, and the storm ahead waited patiently. The mountain rose like a broken blade, its peak veiled in mist and wire. The relay tower stood near the summit, old architecture fused with alien upgrades, cold, silent, and watching. The structure pulsed faintly, its signal threads spider-webbing into the clouds. They approached on foot, no engines, no lights, just breath, heartbeat, and the rhythm of boots on stone. Frank crouched behind a rusted-out satellite dish, scanning the ridge through a battered scope. He counted 3 sentries, 2 on the perimeter, 1 inside, light armor, minimal movement. Bestina didn't need confirmation. She was already moving. No words, no hand signals, just momentum. She slipped into the shadows like she belonged there, body low, breath steady. Frank followed wide, flanking around to the western edge where the cliff curved just enough to mask a second approach. The wind howled once, sharp and sudden, as if the mountains sensed what was coming. One of the sentries turned toward the noise. A breath later, he dropped. Bestina reappeared in the low fog, weapon already sheathed. Another guard stepped into view near the door too late. Frank's rifle coughed once. The shot was clean, no alarm. They regrouped at the threshold, no lock, just an energy barrier, humming with faint violet arcs. She placed her palm against the surface. Her armor pulsed once in reply. "It'll recognize me," she murmured. "Just long enough." The field shimmered, then blinked out. They moved inside. Corridors twisted inward like a maze built by a mind that didn't understand symmetry. Lights flickered along the floor in narrow strips. The air smelled like cold metal and melted data. Frank checked each corner. Bestina moved like memory. She knew the layout, even if she never stepped inside before. "North corridor," she whispered. "Core control is there. That's where he'll be." "Traps?" "If he's here, yes." They didn't slow down. The deeper they went, the more the structure hummed. Alive. A nervous system of cables and pulse lines. The air thickened not with heat, but with intention. At the end of the hall, the door was open. And he was waiting. He stood in the center of the chamber like he belonged there, her cousin, dressed in polished command robes that shimmered faintly in the low light. No weapon drawn, no armor. Just confidence, woven into every line of his posture. The neural override unit dangled from one hand, blinking lazily like it had already decided the outcome. "You should have stayed gone," he said, voice calm. "You were never designed for freedom. You were protocol, possession, nothing more." Bestina didn't stop walking. Frank flanked out wide, rifle aimed, but her cousin didn't so much as blink. His gaze stayed on her, sharp and empty, like he was dissecting her with memory alone. "I'm not yours," she said, "not anymore." "You never were." He tapped the override once, and the chamber lights flared. Bestina faltered mid-step, a flash of pain slicing across her face, knees dipping, but this time she caught herself. The override sparked, then sputtered. She smiled. "You forgot one thing," she breathed. "This armor isn't yours anymore either." The pulse of her rebuilt suit surged outward, meeting the signal head-on, burning it out in a wash of bioelectric defiance. Sparks danced across the floor. He backed up, slowly now. The calm in his voice cracked. You don't know what you're doing. No, Frank said coldly, stepping forward. But she does. And he fired. The shot hit her cousin high in the shoulder, spinning him back against the control terminal. The override clattered to the ground. Alarms bloomed in red across the walls. He scrambled upright, blood trailing down his sleeve. Even if you kill me, he hissed, you won't stop what's coming. I don't want to stop it, Bastina replied, raising her sidearm. I want to end it. And she pulled the trigger. The recoil was light, the result final. Her cousin's body crumpled to the floor with no ceremony, no last words, just silence, the kind that felt earned. Frank stepped beside her, eyes scanning the panels, the pulse of energy still leaking from the relay tower's core. It's still broadcasting. Not for long. She knelt by the terminal, fingers moving fast, inputting codes he didn't recognize but trusted. The tower began to hum louder, rising like a held breath ready to break. This'll burn the signal to ash, she said, and maybe everything else with it. So we run? Not yet. The screen flashed red, then black. The whole tower shook. They turned and ran anyway. They cleared the tower just as the blast wave rolled out. Not fire, not debris, not destruction in the traditional sense, but something deeper energy ripping through the signal threads, severing control at the root. A psychic snap that echoed across frequencies too old for humans to hear, but loud enough for Bastina to feel in her bones. They reached the ridge before the relay collapsed in on itself, folding into slag and silence. The light in the sky dimmed. No more signals. No more leash. She stood at the edge of the outcrop, breathing hard, her armor cracked and smoking, her hands trembling not from fear, but from something older, something closer to release. Frank was just behind her, his coat singed, his pulse still high, but his voice was quiet. You did it. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes were on the horizon, watching nothing, listening to everything, wind, silence, the kind of quiet that could mean peace, or the eye of a larger storm. I don't know what happens next, she said finally. Doesn't have to be decided right now. It does, she replied, because if I walk away now, I might never stop running. She turned to him, no mask, no armor in her voice, just the woman beneath it all. My people, they'll come looking. They'll want to make an example of me, and of anyone who stands beside me. Then I guess I'm standing in the right place, Frank said without flinching. You don't understand what that means. You said that before, he replied, stepping in closer. And I still stayed. She looked up at him, and for a moment, just a moment, she wasn't the runaway, the weapon, the one who burned through everything around her. She was just a woman in a ruined world, trying to decide if she could let herself be more than what they made her. You still have a choice, she whispered. So do you. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was sacred. And when she finally moved, when she stepped into him, let her head rest against his shoulder, let his arms wrap around her, it wasn't surrender. It was a beginning. The sky behind them still glowed. Not with flame, but with aftermath and amber smolder bleeding through the low clouds, casting long shadows across the mountainside as the relay towers remains cooled in silence. Smoke curled upward in slow, thoughtful spirals, as if the structure had exhaled its last breath and finally gone still. They didn't look back. Frank walked with his rifle slung low, boots crunching across loose stone. His coat fluttered in the rising wind, stitched with ash and blood and the memory of too many close calls. Bastina walked beside him, armor scratched and cracked but whole. Her steps were lighter now, not because the road was easy, but because the weight she carried wasn't just hers anymore. They reached the tree line before either of them spoke. We could disappear here, she said, almost absently. Start over, somewhere no one remembers the old names. You'd want that? She thought about it, really thought. Part of me still does, she said, the part that's tired of running. But the other part, she turned, just slightly, to face the horizon. Wants to make them remember why I ran in the first place. Frank watched her, not just her posture, not just her voice, but the fire behind her eyes. Then we rebuild, he said. Not for them, for us. She met his gaze. There was no hesitation now. And if it gets stuck again, she asked, the corner of her mouth just beginning to curve. He stepped closer, resting a hand lightly at her hip, grounding her again not because she needed it, but because he wanted to be the one who did. "Then I'm still begging for it," he murmured. They stood in the hush of the woods, the fire behind them dimming, the path ahead long and unwritten, and for the first time in a long time, they weren't just surviving, they were choosing. Side by side, they turned toward the unknown and walked into it together. She came to Earth as a weapon engineered, controlled, and abandoned. But somewhere in a rusted cabin, surrounded by silence and smoke, she found something they never trained her to expect. A man who didn't want to own her. A moment not programmed. A choice truly hers. Together they faced the ones who tried to control her mind and burned the signal that kept her chained. Now, the fire behind them fades. But the path ahead? It's theirs to walk, not as fugitives, not as weapons, but as something new. And if the bond ever breaks again, if the armor ever tightens once more, he won't just help her. He'll be the one begging to feel it with her. Pause. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, intrigued you, or left you burning just a little, don't forget to subscribe to Alien Chronicles. We have more stories coming, and trust us, what's next will change everything.